So this morning, along with the Apostle Peter, we encounter the risen Christ in and through a woman with two names. The story from the book of Acts is one of healing and liberation, the very message of the early Jesus movement that drew the Roman authorities' suspicion, leading to outright persecution. Written in metaphor, symbol, code, for this very reason, the book of Acts has challenged scholars' interpretation for centuries. However, Acts' historical accounting of the formation of the early church amid that rich diversity of the Roman Empire has renewed theologians' interest for how its narrative might guide our 21st century church. For as scholar Eric Barreto writes, in Acts, the gospel is relentlessly expansive. Acts begins with Jesus' commissioning the disciples to be his witnesses to the ends of the earth. After ascending to heaven, the Holy Spirit descends, setting the disciples on Pentecostal fire to speak of God's deeds and power. They pray for boldness, break bread together, share their possessions, and are sent out into the surrounding communities, healing many. For this, they are persecuted, flogged, and imprisoned. Yet they keep preaching, healing, traveling farther throughout Judea and Samaria before finally arriving to Lydda and Joppa, where we hear about Peter's encounter with the female disciple. She is the only woman in the Bible to be explicitly named disciple. This is a radical call to attention at the beginning of this piece. Additionally, she goes by two names. Tabitha, her Jewish name in Aramaic, and Dorcas, her Greek name. Both names used alternatingly throughout the story mean gazelle in their respective languages, a biblical symbol of spiritual grace and competency. This woman moves between two very different and often conflicting cultural contexts with ease. Like a deer, she is sure-footed in her ministry of good works and acts of charity, to which she is devoted to continuously. That's how the Greek would best render that sentence. Continuously, she is devoted to good works and acts of charity. Likely, she's a woman of means. She dedicated her life and wealth to living among and caring for the widows, women well acquainted with grief, for they were the most impoverished and marginalized population in antiquity. Perhaps this woman, with two names, recalls to mind another devout modern-day disciple, a woman born Agnes Skonka Bojaxu. And yes, I had to practice saying that before this sermon. She is a disciple that most of us know by her second name, Mother Teresa. A woman born in Albania and Macedonia who lived in Calcutta, India, comfortably embodying both of her identities, confidently moving in radically different cultural contexts throughout the course of her ministry, who was devoted to continuously caring for the poorest of the poor. Someone who, when you encountered her and her story, radically transformed your understanding about the expansiveness of the Christian commission. When Peter encounters Tabitha, Jesus Christ is already present, identified in the vivid images of the widows weeping, good works, and acts of charity. The story should sound and feel familiar to our gospel stories of Jesus' healing ministry. Arriving to the upper room, Peter doesn't evoke Christ's name, as he did when he healed Aeneas and Lydda just prior. He simply says, Tabitha, get up. Yes, Jesus Christ is present, yet the risen Christ is experienced in relationship, in community with those who are other than ourselves. Through the Holy Spirit, Peter is the voice and hands of the risen Lord in the way that this woman with two names has been for the widows. In mutuality, therefore, it is not only the woman with two names who is healed, moved from death to new life, but Peter, too, who is risen to new understandings about his apostolic commission. The risen Lord confronts Peter in the form of the holy other, that to which is other than his own identity, a female, embodying both Jewish and Gentile identities, named disciple no less, continuously doing the work of the Lord in the margins of Joppa with the widows. In Acts, the gospel is relentlessly expansive. For indeed, after Peter's encounter with the woman of two names, many believed in the Lord. Like Peter, just when we think we got this whole church business figured out, when we finally grasp those eternal truths of our gospel, that we think we know for whom we think the gospel is for, through whom the Holy Spirit is working, and how we are to enact our Christian commission, the presence of Jesus Christ unexpectedly confronts us in the holy other to ourselves, relentlessly expanding our understanding of our commission and the meaning of what a risen Christ is in our midst. Mother Teresa, our 20th century disciple of two names, like Peter herself, encountered a risen Christ. Hers on a journey and trained to the Himalayas, it expanded her first call from that of an all-girls school teacher to one of offering direct medical care to dying and destitute in the poorest slums of Calcutta. And like the experience of the saints, the grieving widows, and all throughout Joppa, many believed in the Lord through her work. Before Mother Teresa's death, her missionaries of charities numbered over 4,000, raising people to new life in 123 countries, crossing cultural and religious barriers. Unlike the first century disciples, we may not face violent persecution, but we too are called to be risk takers, sent out into new places where we will encounter those different from ourselves, who will challenge us to grow in our witness of Christ's love. It's a risky business to experience Christ's presence and healing with those whose identities culturally, racially, economically, even religiously, are radically different from our own. For we too will die to old understandings and be risen to new life. Over the past 3 weeks, there have been a series of tragic deaths here in Newtown. The homicide of 2 children at the hand of their mother, the suicide of a Council Rock High School student, and the death of a father by the hands of his son. We are commissioned and sent into the grief and pain of our own community as Christ's hands and voice of healing love. Our SEPA Synod at our conference last month resolved and called for renewed financial support for congregations in our struggling urban communities. We are commissioned and sent into the pain and grief of those urban communities as Christ's hands and voice of healing love. The Cantu Project, a medical facility we are building to serve and care for destitute families in Mexico City, is underway. We are commissioned and sent into the pain and grief of those global communities as Christ's hands and voice of healing love. The ELCA nationally is committed to recognizing and challenging the dynamics of power that create barriers to equity and unity in our church and the world. For women, people of color, minority ethnic groups, people with disabilities, people who are marginalized or living in poverty in the LGBTQ community, we are commissioned and sent into that grief and pain to the ends of the earth, to be Christ's hands and voice of healing love. This is a love that has the power to heal us and resurrect all to new life. The risen Christ meets Peter in the upper room in the personhood of a woman with 2 names, 2 identities, Jew and Gentile, that confronts him and invites him to consider that the Christian commission of the Jesus movement is perhaps larger, more inclusive than he previously thought. We too are commissioned and sent out into a grieving world as Christ's hands and voice of healing love. In these acts, we encounter the relentlessly expansive gospel of a risen Christ who continuously resurrects us all from death